During high school, my cousin and I decided to explore an old abandoned building near the edge of town. It was one of those places that people warned you about, claiming it was haunted or that something sinister had happened there. The building had once been a mental hospital but had been shut down for years, left to decay and become a local legend. We thought it would be fun to explore it on Halloween, just for a little thrill. The building was enormous, looming over us with its broken windows and crumbling walls. We climbed through an open window and found ourselves in a dim hallway lined with peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mold was overpowering. We had flashlights, but they barely cut through the darkness. As we moved through the empty rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards and every groan of the old pipes made me jump, but I kept telling myself it was just an old building settling. We eventually made our way to the third floor, which was supposedly where the most disturbed patients had been kept. The place had a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. The walls were covered in strange graffiti, and there were symbols painted in red, as if someone had been using the place for something other than exploring. We stopped to look at one of the rooms, which still had an old hospital bed and restraints attached to the frame. That's when we heard footsteps approaching from down the hall. We thought it was another group of kids exploring, but as we turned to look, we saw 3 men coming toward us. They didn't look like other kids. They looked older, rough, with hard faces and a dangerous air about them. One of the men asked us what we were doing there, his voice low and menacing. Another stepped closer, blocking our way, and I noticed he was holding something in his hand. It looked like a small knife or a piece of metal, and he was gripping it tightly. My cousin muttered that we should go, but the men didn't move. They kept advancing, and I realized with a sickening feeling that they had no intention of letting us leave. Without thinking, my cousin suddenly pushed one of them, throwing him off balance, and yelled for us to run. We bolted down the hallway, not daring to look back, the men's footsteps thundering behind us. We stumbled through the darkness, down the stairs, and out the window we had entered. We ran all the way to the main road where we finally stopped, breathless and shaking. They hadn't followed us outside, but the fear lingered long after we made it home. That night, we found out that the building had become a hideout for drifters and criminals. We had walked into their territory without realizing it, and I'm not sure what would have happened if we hadn't escaped. I never returned, and the thought of those men still sends a chill down my spine. A couple of years ago, my friend Lisa and I heard about a Halloween party at an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. The barn was part of an old farm that hadn't been used for years. Local teens had made it a tradition to throw parties there around Halloween, and it sounded like an interesting way to spend the night. So we decided to check it out, not expecting much more than some creepy atmosphere and Halloween fun. The barn was located down a long, narrow road, surrounded by fields that stretched into the darkness. As we pulled up, we noticed several other cars parked haphazardly along the dirt path leading to the barn. It was nearly pitch black outside, with only a few string lights illuminating the way. Once we entered, we saw a mix of people, many of whom were in costumes. The barn was packed, but there was a strange vibe. I couldn't quite place it, but there was something unnerving about the people there, especially a group of men who seemed older than the usual crowd for this type of party. They stood together in the corner, silently watching, while the rest of the crowd mingled and laughed. Lisa and I wandered around, trying to avoid the groups that seemed a bit too rowdy. She eventually drifted off to talk with someone she knew, so I wandered towards the back of the barn alone. That's when I first noticed one of the older men watching me standing a few feet away. He had a cold, almost blank expression and didn't seem interested in the party at all. I turned away, uncomfortable, but as I tried to leave, he moved closer, blocking my path. He started asking me questions, personal ones that made my skin crawl. His tone was flat, and his gaze was uncomfortably intense, as if he were sizing me up. I felt trapped and scanned the crowd, hoping to find Lisa. I finally spotted her on the other side of the barn and quickly made my way over to her, explaining that I didn't feel safe and wanted to leave. She agreed, and we hurried out of the barn. But as we reached the car, I glanced back and saw the man standing just outside the barn entrance, staring at us. His expression was unreadable, but there was something menacing about the way he stood there, completely still, watching us. We quickly got in the car and locked the doors. As Lisa started the engine, he began walking toward us. I told her to hurry and we drove off, leaving the barn behind. That night, neither of us could shake the feeling of being watched. A few weeks later, we heard from mutual friends that several other girls at the party had encountered similar experiences, with strange men following them or asking invasive questions. We never went back to that barn, and to this day, I feel a chill every time I think about the cold stare of that man as he followed us into the night. Last Halloween, I decided to stay home and hand out candy to trick-or-treaters. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, and while we didn't get too many kids, it was something I enjoyed doing. The night went by as usual, with groups of kids coming to the door, laughing and excited. As it got later, the trick-or-treaters thinned out, and by 10 p.m., I thought it was safe to turn off the porch light and call it a night. Just as I was about to settle down, I heard a knock on the door. It was strange because I'd turned off the light, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door a crack, and there was a man standing there. He looked older, probably in his 40s, and was dressed in plain clothes, a hoodie and jeans. He had a blank, almost unsettling expression on his face, and he just stood there, staring. I asked him if he needed something, but he didn't respond right away. Finally, he asked if I lived here alone, and said he was looking for someone, though he didn't give a name. His presence made me uncomfortable, and I felt a rising sense of fear. I tried to close the door, but he suddenly stepped forward, sticking his foot in the door to stop it from closing. My heart raced as I struggled to push him back, but he was stronger than I expected. He kept insisting that he needed to come inside to use my phone, claiming it was an emergency. I offered to call someone for him, but he refused, saying he had to come in himself. I finally managed to shove the door closed, locking it quickly. My hands were shaking as I listened to him bang on the door, growing more frustrated with each hit. I backed away, terrified, as he continued pounding, shouting something I couldn't quite make out. I grabbed my phone and called the police, describing the man and the situation. The banging stopped suddenly, and when I looked out the window, he was gone. The police arrived shortly after, and I told them what had happened. They searched the area but didn't find anyone matching his description. They warned me to keep my doors locked and advised me to be cautious, especially on Halloween when strange people might wander around. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I caught myself looking out the windows, expecting to see him lurking outside. I was on edge, jumping at every little sound, afraid that he might come back. Halloween has never been the same for me since, and I make sure to keep my doors locked and never open the door without checking first. That man is still out there somewhere, and the thought of what he could have done if he had gotten inside haunts me to this day. A few years ago, my friends and I went on a road trip and ended up staying at a cheap motel just off the highway. It wasn't the nicest place, but we were tired and it was affordable. We checked in late at night and the whole place had a run-down, eerie vibe. The hallways were dimly lit and the carpets were worn and stained. We brushed it off, figuring it was just a place to crash for the night. After we got settled in, we all tried to unwind, but around 1 a.m. there was a knock on the door. We looked at each other, confused because we hadn't called for any services. Thinking it might be a mix-up with another guest, I went to the door and cracked it open. Standing there was a man holding a toolbox. He was smiling, but there was something off about it. He said he was the maintenance guy and needed to check the room's air conditioning. We hadn't noticed any issues, so I told him everything was fine, and he had the wrong room. The man didn't take no for an answer. He insisted he needed to come in, his smile fading as he got more insistent. My friend came up behind me, and we both told him that we didn't need anything checked. His demeanor changed, and he seemed almost angry, but after a long moment, he finally turned and walked away, mumbling something under his breath. We closed the door, making sure it was locked, and tried to laugh it off, thinking he was just an odd guy doing his job. About an hour later, we heard someone trying the door handle, slowly jiggling it. I felt my heart pounding, and we all stayed silent, hoping he would go away. The handle stopped moving, and a few minutes later, there was another knock, softer this time. We didn't respond, and after a while, we heard footsteps fading down the hallway. The next morning, we went to the front desk and asked about the man. The clerk looked puzzled and said there were no maintenance staff scheduled to work that night. A chill ran down my spine as I realized he had lied to try and get into our room. We packed up quickly and left, thankful we hadn't let him in. A week later, we heard a news report about a man matching his description who had been arrested for breaking into motel rooms along the highway. He had attacked several guests, leaving them traumatized. I still think about that night and how lucky we were to lock him out. Since then, I've been cautious about where I stay, and I always double-check the locks, no matter how safe a place seems. Several years ago, I was working as a delivery driver, making late-night runs to earn some extra money. Halloween was especially busy, with people ordering for parties and gatherings, so I was out much later than usual. Around 11 p.m., I received an order to deliver to an address in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. It was a bit out of the way, but I figured it was just someone who lived farther from the city center. As I drove through winding, dimly lit roads, the neighborhoods became sparser, and soon I was surrounded by thick woods on either side. The GPS took me down a narrow gravel road that seemed to go on forever. I finally arrived at a small, run-down house with no lights on, except for a single porch light flickering on and off. I parked my car, grabbed the food, and approached the house, feeling uneasy in the eerie silence. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. I waited a minute and knocked again, hearing faint shuffling inside. After what felt like ages, the door opened just a crack, and a man peered out. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out the outline of someone unkempt and possibly intoxicated. He didn't speak, just stared at me, which made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told him I had his delivery, and he opened the door a bit wider, revealing a dimly lit room behind him with no furniture, just an empty, dusty space. He gestured for me to come inside, saying he needed to get his wallet. Something about his tone made me uncomfortable, so I told him I'd wait outside. He didn't seem to like that and insisted, his voice low and almost threatening. I repeated that I'd wait, and he stared at me for a long moment before finally disappearing into the darkness. As I stood there, I heard faint footsteps approaching from around the side of the house. Panic surged through me, and I backed away from the door, getting back to my car as quickly as possible. As I started the engine, I looked back and saw another man standing in the shadows, watching me with an unsettling grin. I drove off, my heart racing, and reported the incident to my dispatcher. I don't know what those men had planned, but I'm glad I trusted my instincts and didn't step inside. A few years ago, I rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway with a few friends. We thought it would be a fun, relaxing way to spend Halloween away from the city. The cabin was about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town, completely isolated and surrounded by dense forest. It seemed perfect for a weekend of campfires and ghost stories. On our second night, we were sitting around the fire pit outside, telling spooky stories and roasting marshmallows. Around midnight, we noticed a faint light moving through the trees in the distance. At first, we thought it was just another group of campers, but then we remembered we were the only ones with a rental that weekend. The light seemed to move closer, weaving through the trees, and we grew quiet, watching it approach. As it got closer, we could see it was a man holding a flashlight, his face partially obscured by a hood. He didn't seem to notice us, but he was walking directly toward the cabin, his gaze fixed straight ahead. We crouched down, hiding behind some logs, watching him as he slowly circled the cabin, shining his light through the windows as if he were looking for something, or someone. We stayed hidden, hardly daring to breathe. He continued his slow, deliberate pace, checking each window and occasionally pausing to listen. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We stayed up all night, too scared to go inside or make any noise. In the morning, we found muddy footprints around the cabin and small scratches on the windowsills, as if he had tried to pry them open. We packed up and left, abandoning our trip early. The man never made any attempt to confront us, but the memory of him lurking in the darkness, searching, haunts me to this day. When I was younger, my family lived in a small rural town where everyone knew each other. On Halloween night, my mom and dad had a party to attend, so they hired a local teenager, Jesse, to babysit my younger sister and me. We had a nice time trick-or-treating in our neighborhood before settling down to watch a movie. The night was quiet, with only the occasional sound of laughter from kids outside. Around 10 p.m., we heard someone knocking on the door. Jesse checked the peephole and saw an older man standing outside holding a small bag of candy. He looked harmless, but his timing was strange, so she didn't open the door. Instead, she called out to ask what he wanted, and he responded that he had some candy left over from trick-or-treating and wanted to give it to us. Jesse politely declined, saying we didn't need any more candy. The man didn't leave. He knocked again, harder this time, and insisted that he had to come inside. Jesse firmly told him to leave, but he began jiggling the doorknob, trying to force his way in. She quickly locked all the doors and told us to stay away from the windows while she called the police. We huddled in the hallway, listening as the man pounded on the door, shouting that he knew we were inside. By the time the police arrived, the man had disappeared. They searched the area but found no trace of him. My parents came home shortly after, alarmed by the incident. A few days later, we learned that the man had been seen in other parts of town, attempting to enter homes under the pretense of giving out candy. It was a terrifying experience that left us all feeling uneasy, and every Halloween since, I've felt a lingering sense of dread whenever I hear a knock on the door. One Halloween, I went to visit my grandparents who live in a rural area, far from the nearest neighbor. Their property is surrounded by thick woods, and it's a quiet, isolated place, especially at night. That evening, my grandparents decided to go to bed early, leaving me to read in the living room by myself. Sometime around midnight, I heard a faint tapping on the window behind me. At first, I thought it was just the branches brushing against the glass, but when I glanced over, I saw a figure standing outside. It was a man, staring directly at me, his face obscured by shadows. He was so close to the window that his breath was fogging up the glass, and his hand was pressed against the window, tapping rhythmically. I froze, unsure of what to do. He didn't move, just kept tapping and staring. After a few minutes, he disappeared into the darkness, but I could still feel his presence. I quickly checked the doors and made sure they were locked. I stayed up, heart pounding, until I heard footsteps outside, this time near the back door. He was trying the doorknob, testing to see if it would open. I woke my grandparents, who called the police. By the time they arrived, the man was gone, but they found footprints around the perimeter of the house. The officer told us they'd had reports of a man fitting his description lurking around other homes in the area, but they hadn't been able to catch him. The experience left me with a deep sense of unease, and every time I visit my grandparents, I can't help but feel like he might still be out there, waiting in the shadows. A few years ago, my best friend and I went on a Halloween road trip, stopping at haunted attractions along the way. One night, we found a cheap motel to crash at before heading to our next destination. The motel was run down, with peeling paint and flickering lights. It was the kind of place that looked straight out of a horror movie, but we were tired and didn't think twice about staying. After checking in, we went to our room, which was basic but functional. We were settling in when we heard a knock at the door. It was strange as we hadn't ordered anything and we didn't know anyone in the area. I looked through the peephole and saw a man standing there wearing a janitor's uniform. He said he needed to check the room for maintenance issues. I hesitated, then told him through the door that everything was fine and we didn't need anything. The man didn't leave. Instead, he began knocking harder, saying that it was urgent and that he had to come inside. He sounded agitated, almost desperate. My friend whispered that we should call the front desk, so we did. The receptionist sounded surprised and told us that they didn't have any maintenance staff on duty that night. As we were on the phone, the man began pounding on the door, his voice growing louder and more frantic. We stayed quiet, not daring to make a sound. After a while, the knocking stopped, and when we checked the peephole again, he was gone. The police came and searched the area, but they didn't find him. The next morning, As we were leaving, we noticed a message scrawled on our door in what looked like marker. "I know you're in there." We never found out who the man was or what he wanted, but we both agreed that it was one of the most unsettling experiences of our lives. Since then, I've been wary of motels, especially on Halloween night, when strangers might be lurking in the shadows.